drawing that very clear line between like sex and gender, I don't always think is helpful. For like many reasons, but like a part of it is also that it also makes it very easy for people to like ignore the physical reality of trans people who have transitioned.
What do you think can be done to prevent those cases where people regret their transition?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Yeah.
So do you hate me? From the moment my detransition story went viral on YouTube, I knew that I wanted to use this channel as a way to build bridges between people and bring nuance to the trans debate. I wish to promote diversity of thought in the queer community and promote healthy disagreements and conversations, because I think the world needs more of that. Till now, most of the conversations I had with people on YouTube, either on this channel or on other channels, were either with other detransitioners or more conservative people. But what would happen if I invited a trans activist to my channel to just sit down and talk shit out like adults? Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to my newest guest, one of Norway's most well-known trans activists, Aleksander Sørlie.
I'm just gonna stare at you like really intensely and make it even more awkward.
Greetings and salutations everyone, I'm here with my man wife, Aleksander Sørlie. Well, we should do it again, unless you want, unless you want an intro in, then that's perfect.
You know,
whatever works. Whatever works, great. Thank you so much for agreeing to being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I mean, you also came to my place and
yes,
had a podcast.
Did a podcast, and that was really, really lovely. And internet hasn't really seen much of this. Like, would you call yourself a trans activist?
Sure.
Sure.
I've accepted that term.
Yeah. But did you accept that term because that's how people refer to you, or is it the way you think of yourself as?
I think it's a little bit contextual. So, like in trans spaces, then I think of myself as a trans activist. But usually when I move outside of them, then I often don't use that term, because it often has the connotation of sort of not just being irrational, but also that you're not actually someone with a lot of sort of competency and stuff like that. And I sort of do work also professionally, right, within gender and sexuality. So I generally don't use it then. I often prefer terms like a trans advocate, if I have to. I think that's like a more...
I like that,
better
actually.
word.
yeah. You know, I like to think of myself as Detrans advocate as well. And I like that word advocate much better than activist. I mean, there's some negative association with the word activist in media, especially in like today's age, you know?
That's what I think as well. But, I mean, because it gets used so much too, I feel like the battle is kind of lost a little bit, and so now I'm just kind of embracing it and being like, okay, I'll be an activist. I don't necessarily think being an activist for something is a bad thing, even if people want to sort of make it up that way.
Yeah. And the word advocate, you can also apply to so many things, you know. It's better to say like mental health advocate and mental health activist.
Yes.
So there are some instances where the word advocate is much better to apply. Sure. But yeah, what I was trying to say is that you don't really see much conversation between detransitioners and trans activists. And the media usually only likes to portray conflict in this sort of context. So we don't really know what is going to happen here. We might end up killing each other.
It's going to be like a wrestling.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm already offended that you didn't want to have a tea at my place.
Well, I did have a tea.
Yeah, but it's your own. Like, are you afraid I'm going to put something in the tea?
I feel like I just ate the food that you cooked for me, so...
Right. Yeah, I mean, if I wanted to poison you, that would have already happened. Yeah. I mean, you know, that's the secret agenda, to poison trans activists, establish detrans dominance.
That is actually the detrans agenda. Yes.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Everyone has an agenda.
Yes.
There's no denying that.
It's to lure us in and then poison us.
Yes, and I want as many people as possible to transition, so they can detransition, so everyone can be a detrans. That's the secret plan.
That's true. That kind of makes the detrans agenda more complicated than the trans agenda, because you have to first make people transition so that they can detransition.
But that's a good reason why we should cooperate, at least on the first part. Yeah. And can you tell viewers a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing here in Norway?
Yes, are you thinking about with the sort of trans advocacy in particular?
Yes, you can talk about that, but you can also say a little bit more anything else you're working on.
Sure. I can just say a little bit about the sort of history of the work that I've done, I guess.
Sure.
So I started out doing sort of trans activism, if you want, but also like LGBT activism more generally in a sort of a queer youth organization when I was in my teens. So I'm in my early 30s now, so that's like a while ago. And got like more involved in LGBT organizations, and then about 5 years ago, I co-founded a trans organization, which is called the Patient for Gender Incongruence, which is a long name.
That's why you have the acronym.
Yes.
That's what acronyms are for.
It's POGI in Norwegian, or POGI in English, which is very quickly became the largest trans organization in Norway, which it is now. Where I also was the leader for a few years. So now I'm not like in the board or anything like that, but I do still do some work with the organization. For instance, we have a podcast, which is called Trans Norge, which means just Trans Norway, which is she came on, which was very, very nice.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of different work with trans stuff. I think one of the most important things that I worked on early on was removing the forced sterilization requirement to like change your legal gender and to get gender affirming care, which was successful, and that was changed in 2016.
Correct. We can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Actually later, but please continue.
And then after that, I've been focusing more on like the healthcare system. So what I would call like trans health advocacy specifically, which is also why we decided that the organization would be like a patient organization to specifically focus on the healthcare part of it. In part because we had this experience that like LGBT organizations generally were okay or like better at understanding like discrimination legislation around say discrimination, workplace discrimination, bullying, those kinds of things. The sort of larger LGBT organizations were better at, but when it came to the specifics on the healthcare part, it was because it's more complicated, or you need to have more knowledge of like research and
it's a
the
completely
medical
different
system.
Field, you could say.
Yeah, or it's at least it's sort of very different from a lot of the other work that the LGBT organizations are doing. So even if they supported our goal, it felt like we needed a separate organization, basically.
Yeah, so it's like subcategory of like LGBT activism.
Yes.
You could say.
Yes.
Yeah. So how old are you? 30?
31.
31.
I think we're the same age.
I'm 30, actually.
Oh,
so
are you?
yeah,
Okay,
so
okay.
you're. But I never asked you, but do you prefer Aleksander or Alex?
Either is totally fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
because we have the same name. So
Yes.
if it gets too complicated, that's our fault.
Well,
Yeah. Because for me, I always say that I prefer Alexander,
Yeah.
but you can call me Alex if you're in a hurry or if you want to shag.
Good to know. Good to know.
Good
Yes.
to know. Yeah. When did you transition?
I transitioned it's not like a super linear story, and I don't like to go very much into the details. But I tend to say I kind of for real started my sort of transition with like the medical and living full time and stuff like that in my late teens. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, that's like 12 years ago.
Right.
Something
Okay.
like that.
So that's approximately the same time when
Yes.
I first transitioned.
I think we when I read your story, I thought like I thought that it sounded like we transitioned like at a very similar
Yes.
time.
Absolutely. But we didn't know each other at that point.
No, I
Yeah.
think a little later.
Yes, and this is not the first time we are meeting each other. We actually came across each other a couple of times throughout the years between like 2015, 2017, and I also know his partner very well. He's a philosopher in Norway. I would like to have him on my channel someday, especially when it comes to technology, stuff like that. So it would be lovely to have him.
I'm sure you can.
Yeah, I mean, feel like I need to ask for permission
From me.
yeah.
Actually,
Like he's your partner, you know, like you never know what can happen on those videos here. So
we're relationship anarchists, but,
Yeah.
but we draw the line at participating in YouTube videos with others. That's the
yeah, okay, no, that's completely
Yeah.
understandable.
Yeah.
That's completely understandable. I mean, when your partner goes out without your knowledge, it's okay if they're like out there sleeping with someone.
Yeah.
That's alright. But
Yes.
if they're doing a YouTube video,
that's where we draw the line now.
yeah. So you're basically cheating on him right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably will end our relationship when he finds out.
And it's all my fault. I'm
Yes.
such a bad boy.
Detrans people, you know, it's all their fault.
Yeah. You could say that. What would you say are the reason why certain people should transition? And do you think that in certain instances transitioning can save lives?
Yeah, those are two kind of separate questions. I feel like when people should transition, are we thinking like medical transition now? Or
I'm thinking all sorts of transition because, you know, I don't think we should limit transitioning only to medical. A lot of the stuff I'm saying on this channel, a lot of people can live happy lives without transitioning medically.
Yeah.
Just transitioning socially and dressing the way they want, and that can be satisfying on its own. So I think it's very individual, actually.
well, for social transition, I don't really think there's any reason to sort of be very careful about that.
No.
Or like limit that to like in any sort of meaningful way. I think I actually think the opposite as well. I think if we are, I guess, try to hinder people from like socially transitioning that want to, I think that can actually lead to people who maybe shouldn't take any medical transition to do so. Because they haven't gotten to experience all of the things that you actually can do with your expression, and your pronouns and your names, and you know the way that you dress, or sort of non-medical options, and see how much that actually can change your appearance, change how people treat you, and change like how they feel about themselves, because they don't get to even try it out. So I don't think we should be careful about that at all.
I agree with you 100%, and like with my own story, I didn't transition socially until I was already on hormones.
Right.
And I always lived with this stigma that I have to appear female in order to live as one.
Yeah.
Right. Mostly because, you know, I grew up in a very, very conservative country, very conservative expectations towards gender roles and things like that. And now that I think about it, you know, it will be more helpful for me to identify as non-binary when I was younger and experiment with that, and I'll probably grow out of it eventually, because you know, I think a lot of people do. As you age, you can sort of settle in to something. I don't think that, you know, it's something that happens with everyone, but I think a lot of people experience that. But you know, I think like non-binary identities can be actually life-saving, but maybe not life-saving, but useful. in that sense?
I think so too. So I often really struggle to understand why people who are very conservative or concerned about, especially like medical transition and stuff like that, are often also like very negative to like people they perceive to not be like so-called like true transsexuals or whatever, right? Which is has traditionally been just like very feminine, trans women.
There's this term, transmedicalism.
Yes.
Even, right? Yeah.
Because at least for me, I think when of the people that I know who have kind of done some medical transition or more medical transition and then like stopped doing it, or who say like, I wish maybe I would have done like a little bit less than what I did, but who are still largely like trans identified. For a lot of those people, what they tell me is like, I wish someone would have told me that I could like be non-binary and that it was like okay for me to be androgynous and that like I could have just gone on hormones and like not remove my breast, for instance, or that I would have been allowed to remove my breasts but not take hormones, like that they say like, I wish that had been an option for me, that I wouldn't have been taught that I had to be like 100% a man or 100% a woman, and that becomes like an issue. So I think, yeah, I don't think it's helpful at all
No.
to like remove that non-binary category.
No, I can definitely see that, and you know, my goal is that as many people as possible should be living happy and healthy lives without being dependent on drugs and surgeries. But you know, considering the question whether like transition can be life-saving, and even when I look back at my own transition, even though I have detransitioned, now you know, when I look back at how high my sex drive was. In that sense, like, transitioning saved me because I was no longer masturbating 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
And at times, like if my parents weren't home, I would be masturbating 11 or 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
And someone did interview with me recently, and they actually called it a full-time job. That was funny. You're just taking breaks to eat and sleep, you know.
But did you get money for it though?
Huh?
But did you get money for it?
No, that would be a perfect job though. But like, you know, even if I didn't transition, I would most likely be put on some sort of hormone blockers in order to function in my daily life because of that. So like some aspect of transition actually did save me.
Yeah.
But do you think there are instances where like, because you know, some people say that if your kid doesn't transition, they're probably going to unalive themselves and so on. Do you agree with that? And do you think it can be life-saving in that sense?
Well, I know it can be life-saving because I know it was for me. Like,
okay.
and of course, people can always, if you say things like that, a lot of the times what people will say is like, well, you don't know that. That's true for anything, right? It's like you can never know what would have happened if you didn't do anything, and it's not always like easy to point to just one thing. But for me, that was like a very clear thing. I felt like I had tried absolutely everything and was very clear that for me, like if this does not work for me, like if this doesn't work, then that's it. Like I don't see purpose, like I don't understand. I didn't have a concept of even like what it would be like to grow old, you know?
Yeah.
And that's something that I actually talk to a lot of trans people with, is this feeling of like settling in, like transitioning and settling into the person that you are, and then feeling for the first time that you can imagine yourself growing old.
Okay.
It's like, because you couldn't before, but like all of a sudden it's like, oh, but now that I can see and imagine myself as a man, then all of a sudden all of these milestones that people usually can imagine in their future are like available to me.
Yeah, I can see that. Maybe not just available, but relevant.
Yeah, just like they can even imagine it. It's just like a black hole, right?
Yeah,
it's like you can't see it because you can't imagine yourself in like the available options of like growing older or having like these experiences as the wrong gender. In practice, just makes it impossible. Like you don't
Yeah.
want it. You can't even see yourself in it, which I think is also like an undercommunicated part of a lot of. I think a lot of like gender dysphoria and stuff like that is just described as this like hatred for something.
Mm-hmm.
But I think just as often it can just be this feeling of like it's not me. Like it's not me. So it's like I don't think that person is ugly or like that there's anything wrong necessarily with like these traits or whatever. It's just like it does not feel like me. And that is an extremely like alienating feeling that I don't think people can necessarily just like overcome in some sort of sense. But when it comes to like suicide statistics and conversations, most of the trans activists that I know and most of the organized movements that I know of do not talk that much about that. Though trans people have extremely high rates of suicide, and I think there is research that suggests that there's a higher rate amongst people who sort of have known from a young age but experience being rejected on the basis of that. But I also think it's not the most important part, because I don't think that like it's okay. I don't think that something is okay just because someone doesn't kill themselves. Like I would rather focus on like, can people be happy? Like can they live meaningful, good lives that are not just like filled with suffering and despair, right? Because I don't just want to say like, oh well, maybe if you deny a kid the possibility to transition, well, if they don't kill themselves, it's fine. It's not fine, right? If you
but you know,
suffer,
it's not only about that, but it's the quality of life as well.
right? Exactly, and that's super important to me.
Yeah.
So I think for me it's just as important to think about like, well, what is the quality of life for someone who knows that they're trans, you know, from like the age of 10 or whatever, right? And then being denied any and all access until they're 18. That's not an insubstantial amount of time, and it's also like an incredibly important part of your development. And I don't know how that was for you, but like for me as well, I feel like I lost a big part like of my youth.
Okay. You know, I feel like I lost a huge portion of my life because it took me so long to accept myself as an androsexual man. So I can relate to that in that sense, definitely. But do you think we should take time before a person transitions?
Time in what sense?
But is it something you should do immediately after you find out that you might be trans, or is it that we should have perhaps like longer lasting conversations with a particular therapist? And usually I'm thinking therapist that actually cares, you know, because I think a lot of people, they either have a certain bias or they are in there just for money. And it's not only about trans but also other things as well. And I've encountered some therapists that are, you know, were either bureaucrats or money obsessed people and all of that. And I think conversations and psychotherapy can be helpful to determining what the right path for you can be. Because I'm thinking that transition can be a right choice for some people, but there are also some people who think they should transition, but that might not be the best choice for them.
Sure.
What can we do to establish a more clear line between these two groups of people?
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like there's also like several different things there, right? Of course, as a general rule, if you genuinely sort of just started thinking of yourself as trans, or like realizing that this is true for you, as like the internal process, then I think most people would say, you know, give it a little bit of time. You know, think about that and talk with other people. I also always recommend not just talk to like therapists, but like meet trans people, like see what the actual options are. That is not just the things that are portrayed in the media, go and talk to people who actually have had this transition. How do they feel? What are the different options? I think that will give you a much clearer image of these kinds of things.
I like to recommend to people to talk both to people who have transitioned and are happy with that, but also talk to detransitioners as well. And I have had people here in Norway actually calling me personally, people who are considering transitioning, to like hear my own experience with that and why I have detransitioned. And I think that's like super cool to be able to share that experience with someone and that can help them in making their own decision. And I'm not this person that will tell them, don't transition, you're going to regret it. Because I think there's a lot of detransitioners out there who would do that, and I think that's sort of a trauma reaction in a way, when you're assuming that everyone's experience will be the same as yours.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's coming from a ill intent.
Yeah.
But I just think of it as a trauma response in a way.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that can also be true for like some trans people who react very strongly to like detrans people. I think that can be a trauma response as well. It's this kind of like that person didn't necessarily say that or like imply that it would happen to you just because they exist, which is also like I think kind of a trauma response, which is like unfortunate. I think there's like some triggers there that
I think we need more dialogue in general.
I think so too, but I always encourage. And I always have also encouraged people to just sit with the possibility of regret and think about it. But yeah, I definitely, sure. I think ideally any kind of process, especially for someone that's, say, unsure or quite young and not very familiar with being around, because of course it will differ, like what kind of advice and what you should do and not do. Will be different from someone who's like older and has like lived a long life and tried many different things than someone who's like young and unsure. But ideally, me and Luke have talked about this on the podcast before. What we talked about then was like, ideally a process like that should include like talking to like trans people about their experiences, talking to detrans people about their experiences, but also in some cases maybe meeting just like gender non-conforming cis people, like butch lesbians if you're going that direction,
absolutely.
or like very effeminate gay men, and just being exposed to different ways of thinking about and doing gender and like seeing it firsthand, because today it's a very big problem that most of the people who are the therapists who do these kinds of conversations are not like often not even queer, right? They don't actually have a lot of personal experience with and do not necessarily understand what it's like to be very gender non-conforming in like a meaningful way, which I think is unfortunate, because they're not very good at like having those kinds of conversations.
But a lot of people out there, when they think of the word or phrase really, trans activist, they have a certain image in their head of someone who might be, very aggressive, just screaming at everyone, not wanting to hear what others have to say, being immune to logic. And why do you think that is? And do you think that the media misrepresents what it actually means to be a trans activist? Because I'm sitting here with you, and you're not really like fitting into that description.
Yes. Well, yes. My personal experience is that the media tries very, very hard to portray people that way. There's like a very big incentive right now to create an image, I think, where you have like activists on the one side, and then you have like rational people or whatever on the other side, and where everything gets interpreted in sort of in that light. I mean, personally, I think that part of that is transphobia in like a larger sense, which in my personal experience and also in general includes an idea that like trans people, not just trans activists, but like trans people as a group, are like delusional or emotional or sort of incapable of like understanding basic biology.
But isn't that what
understanding
what people used to say about women in the past?
Yes.
And some people still think that too, actually. So
yeah, and I think it is very similar. It is this sort of hysteria thing, right? Where it's both that like you get stereotyped that way, but then it's also the case that when people actively rile you up or something like that, and you do show emotions about something that is highly personal for you as a person, which is also true, right? Like trans people will be more strongly impacted by legislation that is about trans people, right? So they're more likely to have somewhat strong feelings about it. But I think even when those feelings are sort of very rational feelings and are not like excessively aggressive or anything like that, it's just like a show of like passion or care or emotion, then that also just gets dismissed as being hysterical, and people refuse to see the message and they just focus on like the tone or whatnot.
yeah, no, I can see that. But I think the media also does something very similar when it comes to the other side.
Sure.
Like a lot of people on the right also get misrepresented as extremists in a lot of cases by the media. And I interact with conservatives quite a lot, and like most of them are all right people. And I also interact with trans people, and like most of them are like completely all right people. Like I get along with both groups, and I think that what media does is actually creating more division between people instead of getting us closer together. And I think that's like how you can solve all this conflict around like the trans issues in general, because we're sort of in a cultural war.
Yeah,
you could say.
Yeah, sure. I've experienced this myself, like very many times, to the point where I'm very strict when I talk to media sources, because with like demanding that they like allow me to read through things before they publish anything that they say that I've said, because I don't trust them to quote me correctly. And even if they do quote me correctly, they very often take it out of context, so they don't give the entire answer.
Yeah, I mean, happened with me too. So
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right, because they have a very specific narrative.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
I'm sure that's the same for detrans people as well. They don't really care like what you or I or whatever actually have to say, or like the nuanced view that we have. They want us to play a very specific role, and I think that as a trans person who does like trans advocacy, the very specific role that they want me to play is of like screaming, angry, irrational activist that accuses people of transphobia for like no reason. And if I don't play that role, they will try to make it so that I do. So it's like, even if it's cases where people do contact me and I do talk to them and I say like, I don't really care about this topic, I don't have strong feelings on it, it sounds a little bit silly to me, they'll still manage to like find some sentence or something, and it'll be like, trans activist Alex rages against this. I'm like, I literally told you I don't care.
I think with us, what media does is portraying it in a more dramatic way that it needs to be. And I think that media and the internet in general loves seeing us being miserable, because that's like the proof that that's what transition does to you. And it sort of affirms their worldview. And that's why a lot of the work I'm trying to do on this channel is to show that you can live a good and happy and fulfilling life after all of that. And I see so much doom posting from detrans people on the internet, and that's also what gets most attention. And honestly, I'd rather have fun than participating in something like that. So.
I totally agree. And like, one of the things also, it kind of got sidetracked a little bit, but one of the reasons why also I am skeptical of talking too much about like suicide statistics for trans people is because of this. Because I think it is really unhealthy for someone to grow up and feel like all they see is like really negative things about like life as like a trans person or detrans person, right? Like all you just see is like doom, doom, doom.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Does not cause better mental health, right? That makes people feel hopeless. And so I am very careful, and I want to be careful to all, like, yes, we need to get across the ways in which people have been hurt so we can stop people from being hurt, but also we need to be really careful that we don't like paint a picture for like the new generation of people that life will be miserable for you, right?
Oh no, definitely. And you know, there's actually one thing that I've changed my mind on recently, because for a very long time I didn't really like the term gender euphoria, and I think it's because I always associated it with some sort of sexual fixation over your own gender, like that it almost gets you orgasmic thinking about you detransitioning, and that's sort of a form of AGP. It's like autogynephilia or autoandrophilia, but it happened this month actually, and it's an episode of your podcast that I watched. One day we're doing live with Luca, where you talked about gender euphoria, and this needs to portray trans people as happy. And I was like, you know what? I'm with that. Like I'm 100% on that. But do you think that there could be a use of another word for that, so it doesn't like confuses people?
Yeah, maybe. I think it depends like what one refers to too. Like with gender euphoria, a term that I use just for like talking about happiness that I like is like trans joy, which I think is like a cute term. But I think gender euphoria is like often also used like very specifically as just the opposite to gender dysphoria, right? So it's about maybe specific aspects of your body and stuff like that you enjoy. But I actually also didn't like the word gender euphoria or the concept.
Okay, so I'm not the only one. That's good to know.
No, I really struggled with it, and I think it is because I had a lot of gender dysphoria myself. So I struggled with the concept of someone being motivated by gender euphoria, like that kind of positive thing, because to me it very much felt like, okay, but I had to go from this feeling very bad to just dragging myself up to like a baseline. But I've actually had some conversations with some really smart people, including some like trans researchers, and who have argued that they think that focusing on gender euphoria rather than gender dysphoria when people are trying to make decisions about medical transition might actually be better when it comes to hindering detransition, because people are less likely to like confuse it for something else. So it's like, if you feel like, oh, like being called a man or these things, that makes me feel really good, that's more likely, maybe, this isn't research, it's obviously just a theory, but like, that's maybe more likely to actually be a sign that someone is trans and would be happy living as a man, rather than just the dysphoria part, which is just, I'm miserable being a woman. Because that could maybe be something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you know, I'm trying to think of it from like a psychological perspective, and I think a lot of wrong choices we make in life is when we act out of those negative feelings.
Yeah.
And fear is another example of that. People rarely ever make right decisions out of fear or out of panic.
Yeah.
Even. And prejudice is a type of fear, if you think about it.
Yeah.
But I also think the way we handle, for instance, the climate issues, like we are being told to panic. But the thing is, like, we don't really make good decisions when we panic. And I think that we should be calm, and we should be thinking in innovative ways on how we can actually solve that instead of panicking. So, you know, media does a lot of this thing called fear porn, where they want you to be in this state of fear. But people are so much easier to control if they fear absolutely everything around them. Yeah. I mean, that's like classic recipe for totalitarianism, right?
Yeah. I think, I agree. It's also one of the reasons why, you know, I'm not as skeptical of terms like homophobia and transphobia, as a lot of people are, because I do think that so much prejudice is rooted in some kind of fear. Especially because that's a normal critique of those terms, is that like it's hatred but not fear. But I do think that most prejudice does have fear behind it. Not necessarily fear in the sense that like you would be scared sitting next to someone, but
Well, no.
well, that could be of
Do you
course.
think people can have like literal transphobia? Like people would actually be like scared of you?
Yes.
Because I think that could be. I think like drag queens can get this sort of reaction out of people, and also I have fear of clowns, and I also have fear of drag queens. So I'm technically like drag queen phobic, literally.
Like you get scared.
Yeah, I would never ever go to a drag queen show, and I got super scared of a clown when I was a kid, and ever since then I was like, nope.
Yes, it's like the dress-up aspect of it.
Yeah, and a lot of the use of like a huge amount of makeup too. Just it makes it very uncanny for me.
Yes. Yeah, I think some people are. To a certain extent, I think that's even like proven. You can look at some in Norway. They do these like what's it called in English? Like basically like research on people's attitudes towards things, and consistently there's like, I don't remember, like 2% or something of the population who say that they have like actively taken steps to like move away from someone or like sit in a different place because the person was trans, and also because the person was a gay man. Like both of those are like consistently something like 2% of men, straight men or whatever, say that they like have physically moved away from someone because they were like a trans person or a gay man in like public transport and stuff like that. And if that's not like actual literal fear, then like I don't know what it is. And I'm sure for them it would be something like a fear that like it's going to be sexual maybe or something like that. But that's a fear too, right? It's
I have a lot of experience with that, because when I was living in Poland, a lot of people had this impression that if you as a man came across a straight man, he would rape you.
Yeah.
I'll have to edit out this word, but I noticed it's like it's really, really common. But it doesn't really make sense. Why would you assume that man would be interested in you in the first place, and that he would go this far to commit a sexual assault towards you?
Like a gay man or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's just stupid.
Yeah.
I think that way. But honestly, I wish more people have some sort of phobia towards me, because a lot of weird people, for some reasons, like to sit next to me on trains and talk to me. Just recently, I had this 70-year-old woman sitting next to me and telling me how the world is going to end in 4 years and how I should find a wife and have kids.
Oh no.
I was like thinking, wait, why should I have a wife and kids if the world is going to end in 4 years?
Yes.
Aren't I sentencing this kid to like early death?
Yes. That sounds like a horrible idea.
Yeah. I mean, I find it like ethically disgusting.
Yes.
To give someone life if you know the world is going to end in 4
I agree.
years. Just a couple of quick questions. Do you think trans people have always existed since like the beginning of humanity?
It depends on like what your definition of trans people are, I guess. I do think that...
Well, you could say either someone who identifies as the opposite sex, or someone with gender dysphoria associated with their own sex.
Yeah, I think so.
Because I was thinking about it quite a lot recently and theorizing that there's a lot of, for instance, like physical conditions that haven't always existed from like the dawn of humanity, but have developed later on. Like influenza is one of those examples. And same with certain mental illnesses that haven't perhaps always existed, but something that we acquired through our social evolution. So do you think that the essence of trans is something that is innate in our nature from the moment we started existing? Or is it something that developed throughout our social evolution? And I mean, there is no correct answer here, but I think it's something interesting to ponder about.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also a difficult question because it kind of presupposes that like the thing that we call trans, or the category that we call trans, is like one thing. That's like that all people become or are trans because of the same reason, right? Which I don't necessarily think is true. Like I think trans is a category that we use for a group of people that have similar struggles and a similar kind of history in our current culture, but I'm not necessarily like convinced that like all of those people are experience transness in the same way, right? Even just looking at like the difference between someone who says, well, my identity as a man is primarily connected to the fact that I have always felt like I should have male sex characteristics, versus someone that says, well, I don't even need to medically transition, I just strongly identify as a man in the sense that like I want to live that way socially. I don't necessarily think that those two people are trans in the same way. Does that make sense? Like,
no, I mean it makes perfect sense,
right?
At least to me.
So I think there can be some forms of like trans identity that like hasn't always existed, like that are connected to the whatever like gendered social system that we have, and that like that system will, like, depending on how you do that system and how you like socially structure gender, maybe that will have changes on like who ends up being trans or how many. That's like very culturally contingent, but as a general rule, I think that as long as like humans have been like social creatures,
Haven't we always been social creatures?
Yes.
Actually,
and we put a lot of social significance on the body, which is also why it's hard to take away like a desire to change one's like sex characteristics from the social. It's not all like obviously easy for me because we put a lot of social significance on the body, and I think we do that in almost all societies. And by that I mean we put more. We like categorize people. We're as humans, we're kind of primitive. We put people in these large categories, and a lot of that is based on like the physical characteristics that we have. And I do think that people have always had desires to do like, I guess, creative transfiguration, something's called, of the body in like a very variety of different ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think we've always had this desire to sort of overcome our own biological limits too.
Yes.
And a lot of the time when I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking particularly of transhumanism, but like religion is another example of that.
Yeah.
Like you acknowledge that you as a human being are not perfect, and the concept of God sort of represents that sort of perfection in a way, and I think that's where a lot of religious people strive towards that ideal, sort of, and I think that non-religious people also have like this sort of ideal of a human, the Übermensch.
Yes.
In a way, and those are the roots of transhumanism. So in that sense, transhumanism and religion share a lot in common. But I also think that transitioning in itself has its roots in transhumanism. So when I'm thinking of like the idea of being trans, that it's going to mean two things actually: to transcend, but also to transition.
Yeah.
And those are like two different things, right? Because transition implies sort of a motion and a change, usually like from something to something. Whereas transcend, that's like overcoming the limits. And you're sort of doing both when you're like transitioning, because like you're overcoming the limits of your own body with like hormonal treatment, right?
Yeah.
The HRT, it's like your body is not going to produce testosterone naturally, unless there's some sort of disorder that makes you produce that amount of testosterone, because that can also happen, right? So in a way, you are sort of overcoming the limits of your own biology and humanity. So I think that the whole idea of being trans can be understood both as a transition versus transcendence of sort. But there are two words for trans people, and those are transgender and transsexual. And those terms are usually used in terms of transition. But if we apply transcendence there, and you combine it with either sexual or gender, then we are talking about, you know, two different things, either sex as a biological entity or gender as a phenomenal entity. And well, which one are you really ascending? Because transcending. Because I like, at this moment, I think, you know, there are limits to technology and medicine in you know, today's day and age, and we can't really like transcend the sex completely. You can masculinize yourself or feminize yourself through those procedures or through, you know, synthetic hormones. But are you also like transcending gender? Or are you more like enforcing the idea of gender through that? Because I think that transcending gender would mean that you reject the concept of gender altogether. Like that will be the actual transcendence of that, those phenomenal aspects. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it depends on what one thinks about as gender. So, because I think if we think about gender like as a system that has as a core of its system that it is not only binary, right, in the sense that there are just two categories, which is man and woman, but also that these categories are like exhaustive and mutually exclusive, and that you cannot move between them, which I think is like a core part of the gender system, the way that we understand it. If we understand it like that, then I think that like moving from one to the other is like, in a way, transcending that system, right? Because the gender system in the country that we live in, at least, in this context, does not actually allow movement between the categories. And so in that sense, I do think that it fucking, like, even if you are totally binary, if you are trans, I think you are fucking with that system, in either case. And you can just think about that if we think about, even though Norway is like a fairly egalitarian society, right? But if we think about gender as also having had aspects of putting one gender above the other, giving privileges to one and not the other, then you have always been dependent on people not being able to easily move between those categories. So if you think about like classic patriarchal systems where sort of only the man has power but not the women, and where gender in part exists as a way to like exploit reproductive labor, then being able to move from like the female category to the male category is like super inconvenient, right? It doesn't work in an exploitative system at all. But also moving from like the male category to the female category kind of destroys the system, because the system, a classic patriarchal system, is built on an idea that men are superior to women, which also means that men should never want to be women, right? So it's kind of this like, that's problematic. It means that like people can lose their status or gain it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you know, I've noticed it a lot at the time that some women would say to a trans woman, like, why did you decide to transition when you were in that privileged position?
Yeah.
But do you think that like that system exists today? Because I don't really think that.
I don't think that Norway has like a classic patriarchal system in that way.
Definitely not.
But I do think it used to, right? So if we talk about like the gender system, I still think it is interesting to like keep in mind that the sort of gender roles that we have today and the sexuality norms that we have today, even though a lot has changed, they were built in a world that doesn't exist anymore, right? So it's like I think we have a reason to kind of start throwing them away, in part because I don't think we live in that kind of society anymore. But we were talking about like transcending versus not doing. Sorry, but then when it comes to like non-binary people, I guess, or like not doing gender at all, which is sometimes seen as the same thing and sometimes not, you know, like not being gendered is sometimes seen as non-binary, and sometimes not, then that seems more obviously to me to kind of transcend gender, I guess. But yeah, I'm also unsure. Like, I don't think... I'm also not someone that would actually say that, like, all trans people are, like, inherently very radical or anything like that, you know? Against, like, the gender system. I think that, like, there are cis people who live their lives in ways that are way more radical and more of a challenge to, like, the binary system than some trans people, and there are...
Oh no, definitely. I mean, I wasn't that myself back when I was trans. Like, you know, a lot of people say that I bought into an ideology, which is bullshit, because there was nothing ideological for the reasons why I transitioned. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. Like, they transition mostly because of how they feel, rather than it being an ideological reason.
Yeah.
For that. Like, I think it's 100% the case. And when it comes to the non-binary, I'm completely on board with that when it comes to, like, how people choose to live their lives, and I also think it can be helpful for some people who perhaps do not really need to transition. But if we think of it as a metaphysical concept of non-binary, I'm not, like, entirely agreeing with that. But I also think that it's sort of on the right track, but not entirely there. Because, like, what I think is that we should abandon the whole idea of gender categories altogether. Whereas what someone who's identifying as non-binary would do is create more categories instead of. So, like, we're disagreeing there. And also, you know, the way I'm thinking of gender...
I think, like, a lot of non-binary people is also, like, an umbrella category, right? So not just an identity. And so my experience is that there also is a lot of people we would put under that category of, like, non-binary who would say what you are saying now, right? They would be gender abolitionists who say, you know, I'm neither a man nor a woman because I don't agree fundamentally with the existence of those categories. So
yeah.
I do think that there are, like, different, I guess, like, metaphysical ideas within the category.
Yeah. No, and I think it's a fascinating subject, really, because, like, the way I think of gender is sort of like qualia. Yeah. It's like there is an experience of being a certain thing, and a lot of the time, people define gender by feeling. I don't think that gender is a feeling.
Yeah.
Or sometimes, you know, it even gets sort of reduced to a personality trait of sorts, and you see a lot of that on TikTok as an example. But I think of it more as the lived experience of someone. But at the same time, you know, I think that all phenomenal aspects of our existence are so supervenient on the physical part. Sort of like, I think that gender is to sex what the mind is to brain. Mm-hmm. So if you were to shoot me in the head right now, my thoughts, all my feelings, all my dreams and ideas would die in that very moment, stop existing. Right. So in that same sense, I think, like, gender is also dependent on the existence of sex.
Yes.
So I think they are connected in that sense. They're not two completely different things.
Well, no. And I mean, you might probably disagree with that, but, you know, for all intents and purposes, even in English, where you do have separate words for that, which we don't really have in Norwegian, right?
No, that's probably with the Norwegian language. Just to explain, there's one word for sex and gender in Norwegian, which is kjønn.
Yes.
Yeah.
But even in English, sex and gender also has largely been used interchangeably.
Yeah, absolutely.
And been understood as, like, a kind of similar aspect. And there's also, like, a lot of theorists who would kind of disagree on sex and gender even being separate at all, right? They would kind of say, well, even, like, the idea of, like, the sex body or whatever is, like, already so culturally contingent and connected with gender that they cannot ever be totally separated from each other. Like, they enforce each other all of the time, which is kind of, like, the view I have. I feel like, yes, like, sex and gender, absolutely, they cannot be entirely separated in any way, shape, or form. But, for instance, for me, I don't necessarily think it is a bad thing to just have one word, right? I actually like that we just have kjønn in Norwegian
Okay.
to a certain extent.
Okay.
Because I think that the drawing that very clear line between like sex and gender, I don't always think is helpful. For like many reasons, but like a part of it is also that it also makes it very easy for people to like ignore the physical reality of trans people who have transitioned, right? The fact of the matter is that even if one defines like sex incredibly narrowly as like just chromosomes or just like the production of the gametes or whatever like that, in for all intents and purposes, like most of our sex characteristics are not those sex characteristics, and very many of them we can change, like through interventions, and there's an increasing amount of research too that shows that those changes, when you take cross-sex hormones in particular, are significant. So they're not even just on this like cosmetic level. For instance, very interesting research shows that like vaginal tissue in like trans men changes in part to prostatic tissue. This is very interesting.
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely. Another thing is that, you know, actually like reproductive system of men and women is actually quite similar.
Very.
And but maybe perhaps not when it comes to the aesthetics. Like on the surface, you might not think about it, but really, like the testicles and ovaries, they're practically the same thing. They're just like the way they developed, or like an inside, or if they're external. And
Absolutely.
even like the way, like the smell of your private parts changes.
A lot.
Whether you're on testosterone or estrogen, like that plays a huge role.
It does.
In there, absolutely.
It changes a lot, and of course some can be positive, some can be negative, but other things as well. People are doing more research on like an epigenetic level and stuff like that, who also have come out and said that like trans people who are transition have like unique like molecular or whatever like profiles. Like it's on a much deeper level, not necessarily that when you transition or take cross-sex hormones you get identical physical profile to like cis people, right? It's not like as a trans man I would get an identical profile as a cis man, but what an increasing amount of research shows is that it's also very clearly distinct from the body of like a cis woman. And I think it is it concerns me when people split it very clearly between like sex and gender, in this sense where they start to talk as if the like medical needs or like the sort of actual physical bodies of transgender people are somehow identical to like most people of the sex they were assigned at birth.
So, regarding the non-binary identity, I'm thinking like maybe it's not precise enough in its definition, because if I was to say that I'm a binary gender, it says very little about what sort of binary gender am I, a man or a woman. And if you say that it's non-binary, it's not necessarily defining what you are, but rather tells me more about what you are not.
Right.
So what do you think this non-binary category can be?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. What I think it
like if there is a third gender, or maybe if you think there are more than three, what would that alternative category be? Like more precisely, something that describes what it actually is rather than describing what it is not.
Yeah. I really don't know. The thing is that, when you and I started our transition, as you might remember, the word non-binary wasn't used, right? It didn't really exist. And so I remember very well that we tried to figure this out. And like part of that was also just trying to find like a Norwegian word.
Did it start in Tumblr, like the whole concept of non-binary, or was it before that?
I think so. I think it's been used like in the literature a little bit before, right? As just a way of talking about like non-binary genders. But it wouldn't surprise me if it that is like the use of the term as like a gender identity, or as like an umbrella term for all people who fall outside, might very well be from Tumblr. I have no idea, but it does coincide in time, so it might be a part of that. But we had so many conversations, even workshops, like on camps and stuff like that, to try and work with people. How do we find a term or a word to refer to people who are like not trans men or trans women, but are a part of our trans community? Obviously, like terms like gender queer used to be popular. That was maybe the most like commonly used one. The problem with that term was that gender queer was less of an umbrella term, for one, but it was also like a term that people who were not necessarily trans used, right? So someone
true.
could talk about themselves as being like a gender queer man, could be just like a man who was like effeminate, who was like queering gender.
But yeah, we have another word for that. That is like gender non-conforming.
Yes.
Which is already like widely used, and I think that when it comes to like the meat and potatoes of this thing, it's literally one and the same thing we're talking about. I think
gender non-conformity.
Yeah.
I think all non-binary people are gender non-conforming, but not all people who are gender non-conforming are non-binary, right? Which is the problem with the term, because obviously being non-binary, like identifying outside of the male-female binary, is like kind of the ultimate act of gender non-conformity in a way, or at least it can be seen that way. But yeah, I don't have an easy answer for an alternative. However, I have also seen a lot, or several non-binary individuals, people that I would put in that category, that are critical of exactly the thing that you say. Like, should we be defining ourselves based on not being something, right? Like, kind of a negative identity.
It's actually very, very common, to be honest. Terms like an anti-fascist or anti-natalist, anything that has anti in it is usually more about what you are against, rather than what you are standing for. So those terms are actually very, very commonly used. So in that sense, it's really not that uncommon. But another example is like gender fluid as a gender, which I don't think it is a gender in and of itself.
No.
Like, it's more like, well, you're choosing to be fluid in what you identify as, but it is not a gender in and of itself. So is it a gender category? I don't think so.
No. Some people use non-binary as a gender category, but I largely see it as like an umbrella term that's just used for like all of the different, I guess, genders or non-genders or whatnot that like fall outside of. I usually use like the term non-binary to refer to people who identify as neither exclusively male or exclusively female. So that would include people who felt like they identified as both at the same time, for instance. People who saw themselves like a third gender. It would include like the category that you just mentioned, like of people who felt like they moved between those categories or several different categories. It also includes the, to me, complicated category of like people who are like do not have a gender or see themselves as like a gender, which is of course like a little bit of a difficult category because is it a gender to not have a gender? That's also very
I'm thinking about that too, and like a lot of the time I say that I'm a male because I have a male body, but I don't think of myself as a man and a woman, but like I don't identify as anything at all, but like I don't call myself a gender for that reason. I'm just like, I'm throwing it all away, But couldn't you say that this the concept of identifying both as a man and a woman, what it actually boils down to is more of the spectrum of femininity and masculinity rather than gender? Because I think a lot of people use those two interchangeably, but I think it's with masculinity and femininity as a spectrum, and it's sort of a triple spectrum. Because femininity in and of itself is a spectrum of sort, and so is masculinity, but then you have the spectrum between femininity and masculinity. So wouldn't you say that by proposing those non-binary categories, you're sort of creating a new binary between those people who conform to gender roles and people who don't conform to gender roles?
No, not necessarily. Like, also because I think one could argue, right, that like that the non-binary category isn't like inherently more radical, or that doesn't mean that you're like free from gender, or that someone that is non-binary cannot like explain their gender in ways that reinforce stereotypes or whatever. Because, well, I think we all can, right? That's more about like what we say or like the reasons that we give. But I don't think there's anything inherent in that. And part of the reason why I think that also is because like non-binary people are very, very different. I mean, it is a myth that like people can only identify as non-binary if they are, like, if you were assigned female at birth and you're non-binary, that means you're masculine. That's not necessarily true in a classical sense either, right? There are people who are non-binary who was assigned female at birth and that largely live and present in a feminine role, for instance. So how would that fit into like that kind of idea, right?
What do you say there is the reason that they choose to identify as non-binary, even though they might be very feminine as a female?
What the reason is?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, because I'm not non-binary, right?
No, okay.
So
no,
for
but
me,
I'm asking this question like out of curiosity rather than prejudice.
Yeah.
Like just trying to understand that.
well, I think it's a genuine feeling of like not belonging, or not like just saying the sentence, I am a woman, feels fundamentally wrong to them. Like, that's not who they are. And then the decision to kind of continue to live that way has more to do with feeling like that's just a private thing. At least if we're talking about like that category of like non-binary people who don't feel the need to transition, who largely just live in like their assigned sex or whatever. The experience that I have when I talk to those people, the feeling that I get is that there are people who feel like, yes, I'm not a woman, I was assigned this sex at birth, this gender at birth or whatever. I am not this thing, but I'm okay to like, I might as well live this because it gives me the less amount of obstructions and problems in like my social life, so I'll choose to present this way or whatever. But it doesn't feel true. It doesn't feel like, you know, I am a woman, but my gender is like a largely private issue, right? That it's like everyone doesn't need to see this all the time. Everyone doesn't necessarily need to know this all the time. Which is also like one of the reasons why I think the idea that, you know, that it's always this sort of very social thing that people do, that it's you know, about attention, or it's about like rebelling, doesn't really ring true to me, because I know so many people who just kind of just live as their assigned sex or whatever and privately identify as non-binary, which to me seems to suggest that like this is a very real, genuine, just an expression of like who they are, and not necessarily like a political statement or like a statement about gender as it exists.
Well, I don't think that the very being of trans, being homosexual, is an inherently political thing either. I think, you know, we are politicizing those things way too much, actually.
Yes, I think so too.
Way more than it needs to be. Like, I think it should have never been a political issues, other than, you know, just getting your basic rights and not being discriminated against, you know, because that could be considered a political thing, but beyond that, it's really, really not.
Yeah. I think another interesting thing, though, to me, is that I also think that, like, a lot of queer identities, in practice, have, like, functioned similarly to, like, non-binary identities for a long time. But, yeah, so basically, if you look at, you know, butch as, like, an identity, even in, like, historical records, long before people talked about sort of non-binary identity, you find like a group of people who very clearly have like an understanding of their gender that is very different from like most women, right? Now it's like very much portrayed or talked about like, well, why do they have to be non-binary? Can't they just be butch? But then that presupposes that like butch identity has never included what we today call non-binary, right? That they're all like very clearly like women identified people, when you clearly see that that's not the case by just like reading a little bit about like butch identity in the sort of historical records, both in terms of the fact that butches and also like studs have used testosterone and binding and stuff like that for like a long period of time.
True. Yeah, definitely.
But also in this like relationship between butches and femmes, where there's like stigma for butches to be with other butches because it's perceived as like gay, whereas it's not perceived as like gay or whatever.
If a butch is with a femme.
Yeah.
But that's weird because like it is gay just by the very fact that it's a female dating a female, or I would say like a woman dating a woman.
Yes.
Actually, yeah. But
Yeah.
I've noticed something very similar when it comes to like the homosexual community, where there is this sort of expectation that you should be either a top or a bottom, and there's this term that is actually relatively new. It's called side.
Yes.
And that's actually where I fall. Like I'm neither top or a bottom,
Yeah.
and not only because I don't actually have the ability to participate in penetrative sex after the surgery I had, but so I can't penetrate. I can't be penetrated. But even if that wasn't the case, I would still consider myself side because I'm like I wouldn't be interested in penetrative sex to begin with, and a lot of those gay men who are not interested in penetrative sex are sort of feeling forced to it by their community and by the partner because that is the norm, and I think that's really toxic.
Yeah.
And I'm this sort of person, like if I see something in a queer community that I think is toxic, I will call it out. I don't like this idea of just shoving the problems like under the carpet, hiding your skeletons in the closet.
Yeah.
We should be coming out of the closet.
Yeah.
Right. And there's some other like things about the gay community that I notice that can be toxic. Like I see a lot of people who are not gay, people who are not white, who might have a harder time finding a partner because a lot of gay men are actually exclusively interested in other white gay men.
Yes.
And you see a lot of that, especially like on the online dating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, for sure, of course. There's lots of problems with the gay community or gay communities. There are a lot of different ones, of course. They have with their own sets of issues and problems. And some of that is like what you mentioned. I think that like top and bottom thing, or like butch and femme. I've never really been in like lesbian communities myself because I'm exclusively attracted to men, but especially in like the gay male community too, I see this like I partly see like the top bottom thing as like an kind of an expression of heteronormativity in a way. It becomes it's fine as a way to just like inform people about what you enjoy, right?
Yeah.
Which gay people need to do more because it's not necessarily as obvious what role you're going to take in like the sexual context. So I understand the need sometimes like to have a word for that or to explain it, but the extreme focus on people like having to basically choose to be a top or a bottom, and what you said as well, the expectation to like participate in penetrative sex, I think is very I think that's toxic and also probably not that representative. Like a lot of gay and bisexual men do not have a lot of anal sex or other forms of penetrative sex. Like it is quite common to not do that. And just to have other forms of sexual intimacy, but we almost never see that represented or even talked about.
And it's like even people have like no connection to the gay stuff whatsoever have like this idea that that's how all gay men are having sex, right? Yeah. But moving on to the next question, till now we have accepted sort of that you can be trans without having gender dysphoria, but do you think it is possible to have gender dysphoria without being trans? And I wish to sort of expand the definition of gender dysphoria to not just individuals who are trans, but let's say a woman who does not want to have her breasts, or who wants to have smaller breasts than she has, but still identifies as a woman, is experiencing some sort of gender dysphoria towards her own gender or sex characteristics without identifying as the opposite sex. Whereas, you could also have a man who perhaps does not like to have hair on the body, and is experiencing sort of dysphoria towards that, either shaving that, or doesn't like the hair loss that he might be experiencing.
Yes.
Do you think those can be considered examples of gender dysphoria?
Yeah, at least in like a non medical context, because I think gender dysphoria can be like, just for the purposes of like the medical system or whatever, it can be useful to have a term that we use specifically for like the situation of transgender people, as long as like the medical system is the way that it is. I think that can be useful, but I don't think there's like that it would be true that like cis people can never experience gender dysphoria. However, I'm like more interested in like the opposite, maybe, or like what you described. For instance, I think that something that I totally understand as like gender dysphoria, in a even more like literal sense, is like when, for instance, a cis man has like totally non-pathological like gynecomastia, right? So breast growth, and then wants to remove that to have a flat chest, because he feels like as a man I shouldn't have this feminine characteristic. That is like something that I think that even without making the kind of like sorry, I was on track a little bit, but that is something that I already now think of as a form of gender dysphoria. And same with like women, cis women who have experienced like getting a little bit of a beard, for instance, who have like a lot of body hair in ways that are like atypical for women, and who feel really bad and like dysphoric about that. I also like fully see that already as a form of gender dysphoria. So yes, I guess my answer is yes, I do think that gender dysphoria is something that people who are not trans can have.
Yeah, it's so great that we actually agree on that.
Yeah.
I think we agree on a lot of things, actually.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, and there's this expectation that we shouldn't, because of who you are and who I am, and as like the way the media likes to represent the whole relationship between trans and detrans is very turbulent and full of hate, and I think the fault is a little bit on both sides.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to be pointing fingers specifically at trans people, even though I think there are things both sides could be doing a little better in order to build that bridge. But like, according to the common narrative, you should be hating me.
Yeah.
So do you hate me?
No, I don't hate you.
Good. That's a good start.
Yes.
That's a good start. Well, you might even love me one day.
Yeah. Well, anything can happen.
Yeah, there's still time to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll both live good and happy lives.
Yeah,
despite society telling us that none of us will ever be happy.
Yeah, let's hope for that, definitely. What do you think can be done to prevent those cases where people regret their transition?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Exactly. I don't think it's a simple question at all, but I don't think any questions I've asked you so far were of simple nature.
That's true. That made the conversation very interesting.
Yeah.
But like, one of the things that I genuinely think about when it comes to regret is moving away from the kind of system that we have now that places a lot of importance on gender stereotypical behavior and stuff like that.
It is gender stereotypical behavior that got me into this mess in the first place. Right. Yeah.
But unfortunately, like, that is a huge part of the focus, and like in a lot of these like gatekeeping models are viewed as like the way to prevent regret. But there's no actual research at all that shows that those models actually help prevent regret. Like, they're long, they take a long period of time, and like less people go through. But there exists like zero research or like empirical evidence at all that shows that the questions that are asked and the process actually is created in a way that enables us to understand who would benefit from transition and who would not benefit from transition, because it is largely based on stereotypical ideas, right? It's based on
Yeah.
like what you played with and all of these kinds of things.
I'm sorry if I interrupt you now, but I think a lot of only 2% of my viewers are from Norway, actually.
Right.
So a lot of people watching this will have no idea how like this system in
Yeah.
Norway works. You could say it's a very long process to get the diagnosis. It can take years, and it's not even like that detailed in the way they are approaching it, because you are like over the course of many years seeing different people. So it's not like you have like one specific therapist following you for a long period of time, and you have long waiting times before your appointments, which are also part of the reason why it takes a long time.
Yeah.
And there is an expectation that you should conform to a stereotypical behavior of the opposite sex in order to receive treatment in the first place.
Yes.
Did you ever experience that they would deny or try to deny a transition because you are not attracted to women?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question. What they actually told me was that normally they would not give treatment to a trans man who was attracted to men, but and that as far as they know, I was the first person that they had given the diagnosis that had a cis male partner. I don't know if that is true. Because I'm skeptical of a lot of the things that they tell me. But yes, we had like a specific conversation about that, where they told me that they historically had not done so, and that normally they wouldn't do so, but that they, in my case, they were going to do it, and it would be like the first time that they would do it. And that absolutely came up. And it was framed as like, we have become more evolved or something, and like we're trying something new, kind of. With me, of course, I knew that many trans men who had been there before, at least sometimes had male partners, but I also know that a lot of them lied about it in the process. So like, that's what I was told. I also had like very uncomfortable conversations when I got the transsexualism diagnosis, which was the diagnosis that they had back then, where when I was given this, I had to have a conversation with like the lead psychiatrist, and she started asking me questions like, how is it possible for you to have sex if I don't let him penetrate me vaginally or whatever. And she didn't understand how we could have sex if that wasn't the case. And I was like, there are many ways to have sex. There are many holes in the body. And I had to explain to her in detail how.
I mean, it's just basic sexual knowledge.
Yes.
But very recently, someone wrote an article about me in a Norwegian Christian newspaper, and there was some things that were there that were so incorrect that I had like several surgeries following my bottom surgery. And because apparently when the wound I had closed, I wasn't able to urinate.
Okay.
And it's like now you can tell like this is someone who doesn't know anything about female anatomy, like where do you pee from? And I think that's the case with a lot of older men, that they don't know, they think that the urine comes out of the vagina, like the actual vagina opening.
Yeah. That is fascinating.
It really is.
But the lead psychiatrist in my case was like a woman, and I just remember thinking like, I'm so sorry for you that you don't that you genuinely do not understand that it's possible to have sex that does not involve like a penis going into a vagina. Like that, I'm sorry for you that you actually cannot even comprehend that that's possible. So it was definitely like a subject in my process there. But of course I did get the diagnosis and stuff like that. But I genuinely think that the process that they have is a gatekeeping process, no informed consent at all. It's not like conductive to finding out who will regret it or not. And one of the really problematic things about it is that it actually does not take it into consideration that much, like what kind of surgeries that you want. So in theory, like it's like once you get the diagnosis, you just get access to like all of the treatments. It's a very strange kind of system.
Yeah.
So even for someone like me, I did not want bottom surgery. I did get sterilized and stuff like that. So I had like that done as a part of that process. But I remember after that, I had like a surgeon at this place try to convince me of why bottom surgery was good when I said like I don't want that. Like there's so much pressure constantly to do it, which is the opposite of helpful when it comes to that.
You know, I think that too. And I had a guest on my channel last month, Richie Heron from UK, who himself, like NHS literally forced him and pushed him towards having a bottom surgery.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's common, and I think there's a lot of different ways someone can feel pressure to having this, and it can be like a medical pressure coming from medical professionals, but also social pressure as well to like fully fit into that role, and I think both can be like really unhealthy for that reason, you know, especially like those surgeries, they can come with a lot of like serious risks and complications. Like I do not think this is a decision one should make lightly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
just greater, like sometimes it doesn't have to be someone pushing you physically, like telling you should do it either, right? It can be like a social pressure that gets formed just from like experiencing a lot of transphobia, for instance. Like someone that just feels like, okay, I want to live as a woman for a period of time, or I want to be referred to this way and like be accepted that this is like in like a social way, and they try to do that and try to transition socially, but they get treated so badly because they're visibly trans, experience harassment, or just constant like inappropriate questions, or just being seen as nothing but like trans, like not being allowed to just be like a whole person. I think that is a huge thing in pushing someone to go quickly, like want to transition very quickly, to just not have to experience that discrimination, and maybe do more than what you otherwise would have needed, because you just cannot get the acceptance that you're looking for with just changing your gender expression, right? I think that a society that was like largely accepting of and tried to accommodate for people who wanted to socially transition, either to just try it out for a period of time to experiment or like permanently. At least in my mind, I have a thought that this would be helpful to prevent regret.
You know, like previously, you've mentioned that until 2016, like the nationally funded treatment for patients with gender dysphoria was basically forced castration. Like if you wanted to receive hormones, you basically had to agree to go like all the way to have that surgery. And that, I think, you know, that is forcing people into surgeries that can't be like even life ruining. And I think, you know, those complications from surgeries are not something that is exclusive to people who have detransitioned, because a lot of post-op trans people might be, you know, suffering from the same complications that I am experiencing or have experienced, right? I think I'm not a big fan of how Norway is handling this, but at the same time, you know, I think that both this and privatization and decentralization of that can have its own dangers, and decentralization and privatization of that sort of treatment allows for some doctors who are in it only for money to operate in a, well, I would say, morally unjustifiable way, where they're just, you know, all they care about is money, and they don't care about the patient. It's like, here's your hormones, right? And in that case, you're not a doctor, you're a dealer.
Right, so I think that, you know, decentralization and privatization are very different things, right? Because we can decentralize but still keep things like in the public healthcare system. So, for instance, you know, the health station for gender and sexuality in Oslo is a part of Oslo kommune, right? and so that's and they work. I wouldn't say, maybe not entirely, but largely within like an informed consent model. Though they also work with, people are under 18, which where we use a slightly different type of model. But but the difference, of course, is that they're not private, and so there you don't pay any doctors for any treatment in any way, because yes, I'm very far on the left side of politics, so
Okay.
you'll never hear me saying that like privatization is like a really good thing, like privatization of the healthcare system. For me, right, I think privatization or like private people providing that care has been important in Norway because the public healthcare system has failed so hard,
Right.
and I think it is a result of that, and I think it's more dangerous when you do have a lot of sort of private ways, right, of getting those kinds of surgeries or hormones, but it has to happen like outside of the system or outside of like official mechanism that can pick up if someone doesn't actually have the competency in the sector, which I think is kind of what ends up being the case if you have like one centralized, very, very strict system. Norway is also just like a fairly like long country geographically. That's not like very easy.
Definitely. Like if you live at the other end of the country and you have to travel all the way to the capital, which is down south.
Yes. And you have to do that for years.
Exactly. It's not very practical. And it's like when it comes to whether it's state funded or privatized, ideally I'm opposed to both the state and corporations.
Yes.
But because we exist in the system we exist, and if we take that into context, I'm very much pro privatization in most cases because I don't want the state to have all the monopoly on everything.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like healthcare and medicine, I'm rather against privatization in that sense.
Yeah.
Because then it becomes a business.
But
then again, even if it's state-funded healthcare, bureaucracy is another issue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And it is very difficult because if the public system fails, then that's when we are entirely dependent on private healthcare providing for us. And sometimes that is life-saving, right? Sometimes private healthcare will be able to provide things before the public healthcare system does, or they will be able to provide things that the public healthcare system doesn't provide, but they should. But another huge problem with like private or like fighting for like more privatization as well is that trans people are socio-economically disadvantaged. Like all of our research shows this, right? And so this is also like it becomes a class issue as well.
Another danger with privatization, I think, is that more trans people will resort to measures such as sex work in order to afford those, not necessarily in surgeries, but hormonal treatment and everything, which I think should be avoided.
Yeah.
So.
But yeah, I mean, sex work is generally, it's a response of poverty or sort of not having access to.
So it's criminality too, if you think about it. In a lot of cases.
Of course, in Norway, sex work is largely criminalized, and it's pretty much, it's very hard to do in a safe way, right? So when we know that like transgender people are massively overrepresented in sex work, that almost always correlates with having sort of not having sufficient access to the labor market or education, as well as, of course, not necessarily being able to afford treatment. And of course, transition can be expensive in more ways than just that as well, right? And even if you don't have privatization here in Norway, it's even more expensive when you go abroad to have surgeries, which of course, because you did go abroad.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Which is like, then you have to pay for the trip and you have to pay to stay there and all these things. That's a lot of money for a lot of people that don't have a lot of money. Trans people also often lack like familiar support. So even if they did grow up with money, they might not necessarily have it if their family has rejected them.
True.
Have like support to fall back on.
How common is it for families to reject trans people?
Well, there's basically no research on trans people in Norway. That's like very representative.
Exactly.
Sort of the only survey that we have show that it's more likely for trans people to be rejected by their families than for LGBT people. I don't remember the actual number right now, but just from experience from working with trans people for a long period of time, my experience is that it is unfortunately still quite common to have sort of a complete disconnect with the family when you transition. But I would say even the social aspects of transition can be quite expensive, even without the medical parts. Even just like getting an entire new wardrobe, for instance, for some people, which is necessary for some people in order to be able to pass, costs money. So yeah, that's definitely a problem with privatization, and so I'm not a huge fan of it, even though, of course, I do think it is playing an important role to a certain extent now, to just to fulfill that space for people who are denied all other forms of treatment. Like
and some people, and not even a lot of conservatives support like completely banning transition. There's actually a very small minority, but if you consider that sort of solution is to ban treatment altogether, people will try to find other means of acquiring hormones and surgeries, and those can actually be can be a very dangerous way to approach transition that way.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm totally opposed to that sort of proposition at all.
I mean, when I started taking testosterone, I self-medicated. So I did it
illegally. It's very common, actually, and I personally know a lot of people who done that too.
Me too, extremely common. I think it's slightly less common now than it used to, but that's probably because access to care has increased quite a lot in Norway. Both like Rikshospitalet takes in a higher proportion of people get treatment than before, and you also have like other places like Hoke West that do it. But yeah, when I transitioned, it was like just in you as well, right? Extremely common for people to buy hormones illegally, which of course is like totally possible and not that hard at all. Like if you feel like I need this to survive, you'll get it. Like it's not.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Impossible.
It's like any other drug. Like you can get it illegally, right?
Yeah.
But regarding the transitions, do you think it's important to learn from the experiences of people who have? And I don't like this word regret, because detransition is not necessarily synonymous with regret. But there's a portion of detransitioners who does regret their transition. And do you think it's important to listen to their testimonies, to actually learn from that, what can be done better, how we can predict those cases where perhaps this is not the best choice for you, whether someone might need help with accepting themselves as gay instead of transitioning, or if someone had sexual traumas before because of assault, and especially some young girls might feel like they want to escape their femininity because of that assault, because that association with vulnerability that comes with that. How should we approach this problem?
No, yeah, I think it's obvious that there are helpful things to learn by listening to detransitioners and their experiences. And like to me that's a given,
I'm happy to hear that. So you're not going to cancel me?
No, not at all. I think at the end of the day, when we talk about like healthcare being like forsvarlig, what's that? Well, good, whatever, functioning the way it should. I suddenly can't remember this word.
I'm really bad at translating words.
Yes.
I speak three different languages, and if you taught me to translate a word from one sign language to another, I don't know, because I think separately in those three.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, when the healthcare system functions the way that we want it to function, essentially, right? What we want is like two things. We want people who should not get treated to not get treated, and we want the people who need treatment to get treatment. And like those two things cannot be entirely separated. Like I think a good healthcare system is one that's able to take both of those into consideration. And so yes, I think it is very, very helpful and good to listen to detransitioners. I do wish that detransitioners was given more of a chance to talk like on their own in a way, like without being portrayed in like a very specific way or without being used as pawns or whatever.
Yeah, like a media bias there. And you know, that is sort of what I'm trying to work towards, to have our own voices, because till now, for a lot of time, we have been used sort of as a ping pong ball between trans people and conservatives, and are used as an argument instead of being a voice on its own.
Yeah.
That's why, you know, I think it's important to have that space for us too. But do you consider detransition as under the trans umbrella, or as something separate from that?
So it depends on how they consider themselves. Right?
Oh yeah, I
me.
agree 100%. I think a lot of detransitions out there would not
Yeah.
want to associate with the trans label.
Yeah.
Actually.
But I can say that like when we created POGI ages ago, we always had even explicitly on our website that like our organization is for detransitioners if they feel like this is a space for them. So it's like, do you feel like a place for people with gender incongruence is like a place for you? Do you see yourself as a person with gender incongruence and you are a detrans person? Then like, yes, this is for you. Then you are a part of the community. If you feel like you are a part of the community, you are. So if you say, I'm, that can include like actually identifying as trans still in some kind of way, but also just like if because of the transition that you've made, the change of your body that you made, and the current or past lived experience of your life has so much in common with the trans experience that you will be helped by having access to those spaces, to those resources, etc., then I think it should be available to the trans people.
Yeah, you know, I think there's a lot like shared experience there too.
Yeah.
You know, because like as a detransitioner, I can relate to the experience of someone who's trans, because I went through that, and things like post-op life is something me and a trans woman would share. So do you think it's transphobic to for someone who's not trans to not wanting to date a trans person?
No, I mean, not in the way that most people I think talk about when they talk about this. So for instance, I don't think it's like transphobic to have preferences when it comes to genitals or something like that. That seems genitals are an important part of at least some people's sexualities, though not everyone's. But for some people, that's an important part of like fucking or sex or whatever. I think it's perfectly fine to have like a preference, or for that to be like a deal breaker or something like that. That having been said, I do think there are some people who have where those sort of underlying preferences comes from some very negative or stereotypical ideas about trans people. That is something that I think is real. In the same way that you could say that about a lot of different things, right? So,
yeah, I mean, you could say like, I would never date a black man because he's gonna be lazy.
Yeah, for instance.
Yeah.
Right? Or something like that, which, those kinds of ideas, right? Which comes from...
Or he's going to leave me when I'm pregnant.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, or like assuming, or, I mean, even like having a preference even could look like that. Like, if you're like, I like black men because they all have like big penises and are like really aggressive in bed or something like that, then that's like, that's a racist reasoning for why you have that preference. And I think that that's also true can be true, and often is true for a lot of trans topics. And unfortunately, I think that conversation gets really muddled as well, because I think a lot of the time people are trying to have very different discussions. Right? Like
Yeah.
some people are trying to have a discussion which is like, is it okay to not like penis? And then like the other people are trying to have a discussion about like, are there problematic like systems that make people feel or think that like trans people are repulsive or disgusting, or like that affects the way that most people see or view like trans people as potential partners or not.
Yeah.
And those two things are different, like radically different conversations in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole LGBT community was founded on the idea that people should date and sleep with whoever they want.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as it's consensual, of course.
Okay.
So, my take on that is like, personally, I wouldn't have anything against dating someone who's trans. But, I also know people who are not transphobic in any way, who have their own genital preference, and I think that should be respected. And I think it also can be a big turn-off once someone says like, oh, if you were not to date me, you would be a transphobe. Because I might be interested in you in the first place. Like, you just ruined that by saying this, because I feel like I'm being guilt-tripped.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Of course, yeah. For me, it's, again, I think genital preferences are genital preferences.
Yeah, and then there are people with traumas as well who might, feel a trauma associated with specific genitals and might not want to date people with those genitals too.
Yeah, I'd put that into the category of like genital preferences. Though I definitely also do think that there is a conversation to be had about like the way we conceptualize, or like the symbolism that we put into genitals sometimes, or the assumptions that we make about what people can or cannot do. For instance, like the assumption that like all trans women, because they have a penis, they necessarily will like have sex like a man or something like that, which I think does contribute to like that feeling, right? When in reality they might have, for instance, like even if they have a penis, that penis might function in a very different way because they've been on hormones for a long period of time, or they might just have sex or relate to sex or their bodies in ways that don't live up to like the idea that people have, which I think are worth taking into account. But like situations that I think are like more complex when it comes to like transphobia and stuff like that are instances like, we hear stories where straight men have slept with trans women and they have had sex with them, they're post-op, everything like that, not even notice that they are trans, and then you are repulsed when you find out that they're trans. To me, that is a feeling, that is transphobia, because that's not a genital preference. It's not anything physical about their bodies.
It's just the idea of transness itself.
Yes, it's just the idea of transness yourself is repulsive. That to me is like, that's transphobia, right? But if you can point to like an actual specific thing that's not just built on prejudice towards trans people, that makes it so that you're unlikely to be dating someone who is trans, then that's fine.
Yeah, and I think that by throwing around that word transphobic towards anyone who wouldn't date a trans person, but who otherwise can be their friends or even an ally of the trans cause, it sort of can be alienating towards those people. But at the same time, I can also relate, because not everyone would be willing to date someone who has transitioned and detransitioned either. Especially considering I had bottom surgery, I don't have a penis. It can be a deal breaker for a lot of people, and I think that's okay. I have nothing against anyone who would think that. But a lot of people, there's a big question like, would you date a trans person? But would you date a detrans person?
Yeah, sure. I'd date a cis person, a detrans person, or a trans person. Like all of those are open for me. They have to be a man though. That's my
that's a criteria.
That's my criteria. So I wouldn't date a detrans woman. I'd date a detrans man. Sure.
Yeah. Would you date a detransitioner if he had the same name as you?
Yes, though I think it would be inconvenient.
Okay, good. We're getting somewhere.
I mean, names can be changed, though.
True. I mean, I had mine changed several times, actually. Would you date a detransitioner if he had the same name as you and was sitting next to you right now?
Oh, is this a proposition?
I guess. Yeah.
Well, do you want to specify what you mean by that? Like, if I want to try, like going out or something?
Sure.
Or... Yeah, we can try that. We can go have a drink or something.
Yeah, great. We can do that.
Yeah.
We have a deal.
Let's do it.
Great.
Let's try it.
Perfect. Well, I think we're going to finish here.
Yes.
So, thank you for joining me. And we haven't killed each other.
No.
We're still very much alive.
We are very much.
So we're not spreading hate, we're spreading love. Heart.
That's what the kids
Great.
do, right? Yeah.
These days.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Perhaps thinking of something nice to say. For a goodbye. Greetings and Merry Christmas. Thank you so much for watching. Maybe you agreed with a lot of the things Aleksander said. Maybe you agreed with some of it. Maybe you didn't agree with him at all. But I think the lesson we can learn here, that there is much more to being a trans activist than what media portrays. Perhaps media portrays all of us in the wrong light, and we can understand each other better by having those conversations. Perhaps the goal isn't even always to agree with everything the other person says, but to be able to understand their perspective and where they're coming from. This can bring us closer together.